The frontier of Texas in 1875 was no place for the faint of heart. Between the harsh elements, scarce resources, and ever-present tension between settlers and native tribes, survival required both grit and compassion. For Martha Caldwell, a widow struggling to maintain her small ranch after her husband's death, these qualities would be tested beyond measure when an unexpected discovery changed the course of her life forever. This is the remarkable true story of how one woman's act of humanity in rescuing a starving Comanche child led to a confrontation that would become the stuff of legend across the western frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1875 brought a drought to West Texas that seemed determined to break both land and spirit. 3 months without substantial rain had transformed the once vibrant prairie surrounding Martha Caldwell's modest ranch into a landscape of cracked earth and withered vegetation. Cattle lowed mournfully in the distance, their ribs increasingly visible as grazing land deteriorated with each passing week. At 42, Martha had weathered more than her fair share of hardship. The fading daguerreotype of her husband Thomas, killed 5 years prior in a riding accident, remained her only companion most evenings after the ranch hands retired to their quarters. Their dream of building a prosperous cattle operation now rested solely on her shoulders, a burden made heavier by the drought and the persistent whispers from neighboring ranchers that a woman alone couldn't possibly succeed. The Rocking Sea Ranch sat on the eastern edge of Comanche territory, though the tribe had largely moved further west following increased military presence in the region. Relations had been relatively peaceful on this stretch of frontier for almost 2 years, but everyone knew such truces were fragile as gossamer. Martha took reasonable precautions, but refused to live in constant fear. "We're down another 3 inches in the main well, Mrs. Caldwell," reported Jackson Reed, her foreman of 3 years and the only hand who'd remained loyal after Thomas died. Martha wiped sweat from her brow with a withered hand. "How much water do we have left in the reserve basin?" "Maybe 2 weeks' worth if we're careful." Jackson's weathered face betrayed genuine concern. At 58, he'd seen droughts before, but the severity of this one had even him worried. "Then we'll be careful," Martha replied with the pragmatic determination that had become her hallmark. "I'll ride out to check the western springs myself. Maybe there's still some water there we can transport back." "I could do that for you, ma'am," Jackson offered, though he knew what her response would be. Martha's lips curved into a slight smile. "You've got enough to manage here. Besides, I need to clear my head. Been cooped up too long with the accounts." The western edge of her property was seldom visited, a rocky, less hospitable stretch that Thomas had purchased mainly as a buffer between their grazing land and Comanche hunting grounds. A series of limestone formations created a natural boundary, with several small springs that normally provided water year-round. If any water remained on her land, it would be there, hidden among the rocks and protected from the relentless sun. Martha set out shortly after dawn the next morning, her sturdy paint mare Penny laden with empty canteens and 2 small barrels. The journey would take the better part of the day, and she'd prepared to camp overnight if necessary. Her Winchester rifle rested in its scabbard, not out of expectation of trouble, but from the frontier wisdom that taught preparation was often the difference between life and death. The sun climbed mercilessly as Martha rode, the wide-brimmed hat offering scant protection against its intensity. By midday, she'd reached the limestone formations, their pale surfaces reflecting the sunlight with painful brightness. Dismounting, she led Penny carefully through the maze of rock, searching for the largest of the springs. The first 2 springs she located had dried completely, leaving nothing but cracked mud and mineral deposits. Martha's hope began to fade with each unsuccessful search. If the drought continued much longer, she'd have no choice but to sell off half her herd at rock-bottom prices just to save the rest. A financial blow that might prove insurmountable. It was while searching for the third spring that she heard it, so faint that at first she thought it might be the wind playing tricks. A whimper, rising from somewhere among the rocks ahead. Martha froze, her hand instinctively moving toward her rifle. Wild animals, especially predators, grew desperate during droughts, but this sound, it seemed almost human. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet landscape. "Is someone there?" No response came, but the whimpering continued. Martha moved carefully toward the sound, leading Penny behind her. As she rounded a large boulder, she discovered the source, an old well, one she hadn't known existed on her property. The limestone around it was crumbling, its wooden cover long since rotted away, and from within came the unmistakable sounds of a child in distress. Martha rushed forward, dropping to her knees at the well's edge. Peering into the darkness below, she could just make out a small figure huddled against the stone wall about 15 feet down. There was barely a foot of water at the bottom, not enough to drown in, but the well's smooth sides offered no way to climb out. "Hold on," she called down. "I'm going to get you out of there." The child looked up, and Martha's breath caught in her throat. It was a young boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, with the distinctive features and clothing of the Comanche. His dark eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, locked with hers for a long moment. Then he spoke, words in his native tongue that Martha couldn't understand, though the desperate tone needed no translation. Martha's mind raced. What was a Comanche child doing alone, so far from his people? The nearest band was reported to be at least 50 miles west. Had he wandered off? Been abandoned? The questions could wait. Right now, the boy needed help. With no rope at hand, Martha quickly unbuckled Penny's saddle blanket and began tearing it into strips, knotting them together to form a makeshift rope. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. She secured one end to her saddle horn and tested it with several sharp tugs before lowering the other end into the well. "Grab hold," she called, making a pulling motion with her hands. "I'll pull you up." The boy seemed to understand her gestures, if not her words. His small hands grasped the fabric line, but when he tried to hold his weight, Martha could see him wince in pain. His right arm appeared injured, possibly broken. This complicates matters significantly. "Hold tight with your good arm," Martha encouraged, again demonstrating with gestures. "I'll do the pulling." It took 3 attempts before they established a working system. The boy held on as best he could with his uninjured arm, while Martha slowly backed Penny up, using the horse's strength to raise the child from the well. When he finally appeared over the edge, Martha rushed forward to pull him to safety, noting with alarm how light and fragile he felt in her arms. The boy was in worse condition than she'd initially thought. Besides the injured arm, he was severely dehydrated and malnourished. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his cheeks hollow. Martha guessed he must have been trapped in the well for at least 2 days, perhaps longer. She cradled him gently while retrieving her canteen. "Small sips," she cautioned, demonstrating before helping him drink. The boy took the water gratefully, his eyes never leaving her face, as if trying to determine whether she represented salvation or a new threat. As he drank, Martha assessed his condition more thoroughly. The broken arm needed to be set and splinted. He had numerous scrapes and bruises, and his body temperature felt dangerously low despite the heat of the day, a common sign of severe dehydration. Getting him back to the ranch for proper care was imperative, but the journey would take hours, and the boy was in no condition to ride normally. With gentle efficiency born from years of handling injured ranch hands and livestock, Martha fashioned a sling for the boy's arm using strips from her spare shirt. She then created a secure seat on Penny's back, positioning the child in front of her where she could hold him steady during the ride home. "My name is Martha," she said, pointing to herself as they prepared to depart. "Martha," the boy watched her silently for a long moment before responding in a voice barely above a whisper. "Tabe!" He pointed to himself with his good hand. "Tabe!" Martha smiled. "Well, Tabe, we're going to get you fixed up. You're safe now." Whether he understood her words or just her tone, Tabe relaxed slightly against her as they began the journey back to the ranch. The return trip would be slower and more challenging than the outbound journey, but Martha set a steady pace, mindful of her passenger's fragile condition. As they rode, Martha's mind turned to the potential complications of her rescue. Relations with the Comanche had been peaceful recently, but tensions always simmered beneath the surface. Taking a tribal child, even to save his life, could be misinterpreted. She would need to find a way to return Tabe to his people once he had recovered. But first, she needed to ensure he survived. The sun was setting by the time the ranch buildings came into view. Jackson emerged from the barn as they approached, his expression shifting from relief to shock as he registered the small passenger. "In Martha's arms, Mrs. Caldwell. What in heaven's name? I found him trapped in an old well out by the Western Springs," Martha explained as she carefully dismounted, still holding Tabe. "He's injured and half-starved. Jackson, I need you to ride for Dr. Miller. Tell him it's urgent." Jackson's gaze lingered on the boy's Comanche clothing and appearance. "Ma'am, are you sure that's wise? If his people come looking—" "What would you have me do, Jackson? Leave him to die?" Martha's tone brooked no argument. "He's a child, no matter what his heritage. Now please, get the doctor." With a reluctant nod, Jackson headed for the stables while Martha carried Tabe into the house. Her late husband's study had been converted to a ground-floor bedroom after his death. She couldn't bear to sleep in their former room upstairs, and it was here that she brought the boy, laying him gently on the bed. Sarah Jenkins, the young woman who helped with household duties, gasped when Martha called her in to assist. "A Comanche child, here!" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "He needs our help, Sarah. Please fetch clean water, bandages, and some of that bone. Broth from yesterday's dinner." Martha's firm but kind demeanor left no room for debate, and Sarah hurried to comply. Over the next hour, Martha cleaned Tabe's wounds, coaxed more water and a little broth into him, and made him as comfortable as possible while they waited for the doctor. The boy remained mostly silent, watching her with wary but increasingly trusting eyes. When pain caused him to cry out, he would quickly suppress the sound, displaying a stoicism that seemed beyond his years. Dr. Daniel Miller arrived shortly before midnight, his weathered face grave as Martha explained the situation. He examined Tabe thoroughly, confirming Martha's assessment of a broken arm along with dehydration and malnourishment. "The arm's a clean break," Dr. Miller reported as he worked to set the bone. "With proper care, it should heal completely. The dehydration is my greater concern. He's young and resilient, but he was very near the end of his endurance when you found him, Martha." Martha nodded, holding Tabe's good hand as the doctor worked. The boy had whimpered only once during the painful procedure of setting his arm, earning an approving nod from the physician. "Brave little fellow," Dr. Miller commented as he finished splinting the arm. "Keep getting fluids and simple foods into him. Nothing too rich at first. His body needs to adjust gradually." As the doctor packed his bag to leave, he pulled Martha aside, his voice lowered. "Martha, I understand why you couldn't leave him, but have you considered the consequences? If word spreads that you're harboring a Comanche child—" "I'm not harboring him, Daniel. I'm healing him. Once he's strong enough, I'll find a way to return him to his people. The doctor sighed. The nearest Comanche band is Chief Stone Wolf's group, last reported near the Pecos River. They've been peaceful lately, but they're fiercely protective of their children. If they think you've taken one of their own, what would you have done? Martha challenged quietly. After a moment, Dr. Miller shook his head with a rueful smile. Exactly what you did, I suppose. Just be careful, Martha. Send word if his condition changes. After the doctor departed, Martha settled into a chair beside Tabe's bed, prepared for a night of vigilance. The boy had finally succumbed to exhaustion, his breathing steady but shallow. In sleep, the wariness left his face, revealing just how young he truly was. Martha gently brushed a strand of dark hair from his forehead. What happened to you, little one? How did you end up so far from home? The questions remained unanswered as the night deepened. Outside, the drought-stricken land lay quiet beneath a canopy of stars, offering no hints of the events that had brought this child to her care, or what consequences might follow. Dawn brought a slight improvement in Taabe's condition. His fever had broken during the night, and he accepted water and thin porridge with increasing strength. By midday, he was alert enough to take in his surroundings with curious eyes, though he remained cautious around anyone other than Martha. Jackson reported that word of their visitor had already spread among the ranch hands, generating mixed reactions. Most were sympathetic to the child's plight, but concerned about potential repercussions. Two hands had even requested permission to bring their families into the main house at night, fearing Comanche retaliation. "People are nervous, Mrs. Caldwell," Jackson explained. "Memories run long out here." Martha understood their concerns. The Texas frontier had witnessed decades of violence between settlers and native tribes, with atrocities committed on both sides. Peace was recent and fragile, but looking at the injured child resting in her bed, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. "Tell them I understand their concerns, Jackson. Anyone who wishes to bring their families closer to the main house may do so, but that boy stays until he's well enough to travel." As the day progressed, Martha began to earn small but significant victories in communicating with Taabe. Through gestures and simple words, she learned that he had been separated from his family during a hunting expedition. He had wandered for days before discovering the well and falling in while trying to reach the small amount of water visible at the bottom. By evening, Tabe had even attempted a shy smile when Martha brought him a carved wooden horse that had belonged to her husband in his youth. The gesture nearly brought tears to her eyes, a reminder that beneath the layers of fear and cultural difference was simply a child responding to kindness. That night, as Martha checked on Tabe one final time before retiring to the sofa in the adjoining room, he spoke more clearly than he had since his rescue, forming words that seemed practiced, as if he'd been silently rehearsing them. "Thank you," he said carefully, the English words awkward but unmistakable on his tongue. Martha's surprise must have shown on her face, for Tabe's expression grew concerned. "Good?" he asked hesitantly. "Very good," Martha assured him, smiling warmly as she tucked the blanket around him. "Very good indeed, Tabe." It was a small moment of connection across the vast divide of their different worlds, a flicker of understanding that Martha would hold close in the difficult days to come. For neither of them could know that less than 70 miles west, a Comanche search party was moving steadily eastward, following the faint trail of a missing child, and with each passing hour they drew closer to the rocking sea ranch, their determination fueled by a grief that would accept nothing less than answers. 3 days after rescuing Tabe from the well, Martha Caldwell would find her compassion tested in ways she could never have imagined, and the future of her ranch, her people, and the child she had saved would hang in the balance of a single crucial confrontation. The second day of Tabe's recovery brought subtle changes to the rocking sea ranch. The morning air carried a heaviness that had nothing to do with the ongoing drought. Martha noticed it as she crossed the yard toward the bunkhouse, feeling the weight of eyes following her movements. The ranch hands went about their duties with unusual quietness, conversations ceasing whenever she approached. "They're scared, Mrs. Caldwell," Jackson explained when Martha confronted him about the atmosphere. "Wilson's wife claims she saw smoke. Signals to the west yesterday evening." Martha's hand instinctively moved to her throat. "Did she now? And does Mrs. Wilson speak Comanche signal code?" Jackson had the good grace to look uncomfortable. "No, ma'am, but nothing," Martha cut him off. "I won't have this ranch governed by fear and superstition. The boy is improving, and once he's strong enough to travel, we'll find a way to return him safely to his people." Despite her outward confidence, Martha felt the first stirrings of unease as she returned to the house. The Comanche were expert trackers, and if a search party was indeed looking for Taabe, they would eventually discover his trail leading to her property. The question was whether they would arrive with vengeance or gratitude in their hearts. Inside, she found Taabe sitting up in bed, awkwardly attempting to feed himself porridge with his uninjured hand. His dark eyes brightened when she entered, a transformation that warmed something deep in Martha's chest. "Good morning," she greeted him, taking a seat beside the bed. "You're looking stronger today." Taabe nodded, struggling with the English greeting he'd practiced. Good morning." "Very good," Martha encouraged, helping him steady the spoon. "Small steps, Taabe. That's how we make progress." Through a combination of gestures, simple English words, and the few Comanche phrases Martha had learned from a trader years earlier, they engaged in their most substantial communication yet. Martha learned that Taabe was 8 summers old and the youngest son of an important man in his tribe. He had been with his older brother Neshoba when they became separated during a sudden dust storm 3 days before Martha found him. "Your family must be very worried," Martha said softly, though she knew he couldn't fully understand her words. "They're looking for you, I'm sure of it." Taabe seemed to grasp her meaning. He nodded solemnly, looking toward the window as if he could see beyond the ranch to wherever his people might be. Then he surprised Martha by placing his small hand over hers. "Martha, good," he said with conviction. "Help Taabe." The simple declaration brought unexpected tears to her eyes. In a world where the complex histories between their peoples so often led to bloodshed, this moment of pure gratitude transcended boundaries of language and culture. The tender moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Martha moved quickly to the window, her heart racing as she recognized the dust cloud of riders approaching from the east, not from the direction of Comanche territory. "It's all right," she assured Taabe, who had tensed at her reaction. "Friends coming." Outside, she recognized Sheriff Ben Hawkins and 2 deputies pulling up to the hitching post. The sheriff's presence was unexpected. His visits to outlying ranches were rare, unless trouble had already occurred or was brewing. "Sheriff," Martha greeted him as she stepped onto the porch. "What brings you out this way?" Ben Hawkins removed his hat, revealing graying hair matted with sweat. He'd been sheriff of Limestone County for 15 years, earning respect for his fairness, even among those who disapproved of his occasional leniency toward the native tribes. "Word travels fast, Martha," he said, declining to dismount. "Heard. You brought a Comanche boy onto your property." Martha's spine stiffened. "I rescued a child who was trapped and dying in an abandoned well on my land, yes. The Ellis brothers rode into town this morning, saying there's a Comanche war party headed this way," the sheriff continued, ignoring her correction. "Claimed they spotted at least 15 braves moving east along Willow Creek." "And you believe the Ellis brothers?" Martha asked skeptically. The Ellis family was known for their hatred of all native peoples after losing their father in a raid years earlier. Their reports often proved exaggerated at best, fabricated at worst. Sheriff Hawkins sighed, wiping his brow with a bandana. I believe they saw something. Whether it was 15 braves or 5 hunters is another matter, but if there is a party coming this way, having that boy here could put you in danger. What would you have me do, Ben? Turn him out before he's healed? Hand him over to your deputies? Martha challenged. He's a child, not a bargaining chip. The sheriff studied her for a long moment. Always did admire your principles, Martha. Thomas would be proud. He settled his hat back on his head. I'm stationing Deputy Lewis here temporarily, not to interfere with your patient, but to provide additional security and a line of communication back to town if needed. Martha wanted to refuse, but recognized the wisdom in having an official presence should a Comanche party indeed arrive. She nodded her agreement. One more thing, Sheriff Hawkins added as his deputy dismounted. If they do come, let me or Deputy Lewis do the talking. No offense, Martha, but this situation requires careful handling. After the sheriff departed, Martha introduced Deputy Lewis to the ranch staff, arranging quarters for him in the bunkhouse. The young deputy seemed uncomfortable with his assignment, but maintained a professional demeanor. His presence added yet another layer of tension to the already strained atmosphere. That afternoon, Martha sat with Tabe on the porch, allowing him his first breath of fresh air since his rescue. The boy's condition had improved remarkably in just 2 days. The hollow look had left his eyes, and though his broken arm remained splintered, he moved with increasing energy. As Tabe contentedly whittled at a stick with a small knife Martha had given him, a task he could manage one-handed, she contemplated their situation. The likelihood of a Comanche search party had grown from possibility to probability. Her decision to rescue Tabe had been instinctive and right, but she hadn't fully considered the potential consequences for her ranch and the people who depended on her for their livelihood. Mrs. Caldwell! Jackson's urgent call broke through her thoughts. He was running from the western fence line, rifle in hand. Riders coming in from the west, at least a dozen. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood, automatically placing herself between Tabe and the approaching threat. Get Deputy Lewis, she ordered, keeping her voice steady. Then tell the men to hold positions. No one fires unless I give the word. She turned to Tabe, who had gone very still, his small face a mask of conflicting emotions. Hope mingled with fear. Is it your people? She asked, gesturing toward the horizon. Tabe stood unsteadily, shading his eyes to peer at the distant figures. His sharp intake of breath was answer enough. Family, he said, his voice trembling. Nashoba. Father. Relief flooded Martha at the confirmation that the approaching riders included Taabe's family, followed immediately by a new anxiety. Would they understand that she had saved their child, or would they see only a white woman who had taken him? Deputy Lewis arrived, buckling on his gun belt as he assessed the situation. I count 14 riders, ma'am. Definitely Comanche. The boy recognizes his family among them, Martha informed him. This may yet end peacefully if we're smart about it. Sheriff's orders were to handle any contact, Lewis reminded her nervously. Martha fixed him with a firm gaze. With all due respect to the sheriff, this is my land, and that boy's welfare is my primary concern. I'll handle the initial contact. You stay close and ready, but visible and non-threatening. The young deputy seemed about to protest, but instead nodded reluctantly. Martha suspected his deference had more to do with his youth than agreement with her approach. She turned back to Tabe, kneeling to meet his eyes. I'm going to take you to your family, but you must help them understand that I was helping you. Can you do that? Tabe nodded solemnly, placing his good hand on her shoulder with surprising gentleness. Martha, friend, he said with conviction. The Comanche party approached steadily. Now close enough that Martha could make out individuals, they rode in a formation that suggested both caution and purpose, with a tall figure on a painted stallion at their center. Unlike the chaotic raids depicted in sensationalist newspaper accounts, this was a disciplined group with clear leadership. Martha instructed Jackson to keep the ranch hands back, away from their weapons, but within reach if needed. Taking Tabe's hand, she walked slowly to the edge of the yard, stopping at a point midway between her home and the approaching riders. Deputy Lewis positioned himself a respectful distance behind her. The Comanche party halted about 50 yards away. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the central figure raised his hand in a gesture that was neither threatening nor entirely peaceful. Acknowledgement without commitment. Martha gently urged Tabe forward a few steps, remaining close, but allowing him to be clearly seen. The effect was immediate. A younger rider broke formation with a cry that carried across the distance, spurring his horse forward before being called back sharply by the leader. The leader himself then advanced alone, his bearing regal and his face expressionless beneath the shadow of swept-back hair adorned with a single eagle feather. He stopped 20 paces from Martha, regarding her with intense scrutiny before his gaze shifted to Tabe. Words flowed between them in the Comanche language, the man's voice deep and controlled, Tabe's responses eager and animated as he gestured toward Martha and his splintered arm. Deputy Lewis shifted uncomfortably behind Martha. "Mrs. Caldwell, I don't like this. We can't understand what they're saying." "We don't need to," Martha replied, without taking her eyes from the scene before her. "The boy is speaking for us." After several minutes of conversation, the Comanche leader's expression remained unreadable as he turned his attention back to Martha. To her surprise, he addressed her in heavily accented but comprehensible English. "I am Stone Wolf. This boy is my son." His voice carried the weight of authority, accustomed to being heeded. "He says you pulled him from Earthmouth and healed his broken wing." Martha nodded, maintaining direct eye contact despite her racing heart. "Your son fell into an old well on my land. He was trapped for days without food, with very little water. I brought him home and had our doctor tend to his arm." Stone Wolf studied her for another long moment. "Why would white woman help a Comanche child?" "He's a child," Martha answered simply. "That matters more than anything else." Something flickered in Stone Wolf's dark eyes, a recognition perhaps, or a reassessment. He turned in his saddle and beckoned. The young warrior who had broken formation earlier rode forward immediately, dismounting in a fluid motion before rushing to Tabe. The family resemblance was unmistakable. This was Nashoba, the brother Tabe had mentioned. The reunion between brothers brought unexpected emotion to Martha's throat. Nashoba knelt, examining Taabe's splintered arm with gentle touches, while the younger boy spoke rapidly, clearly recounting his ordeal and rescue. Stone Wolf dismounted, now approaching until he stood directly before Martha. His imposing height forced her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, but she refused to step away or show any sign of intimidation. "The white woman has courage," he observed, his tone neutral. "The white woman has a name," Martha replied evenly. "Martha Caldwell." A surprised murmur rippled through the warriors who had drawn closer, and Martha worried briefly that her directness might have been a mistake. But Stone Wolf's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes. "Martha, Caldwell has strong medicine to speak to a Comanche chief. I speak to you as one parent to another," Martha clarified. "Nothing more or less." Stone Wolf considered this, then nodded once. He turned toward his warriors and spoke several sentences in their language. The tension in their posture visibly eased, though they remained alert. "My son says you refused." "To give him to your sheriff," Stonewolf said, turning back to Martha, "that you protected him as your own child." Martha's gaze flickered to Deputy Lewis, whose hand had moved closer to his sidearm at the mention of the sheriff. She gave a small shake of her head before addressing Stonewolf again. "The sheriff suggested I turn Tabe over to him for safekeeping. I declined. Tabe needed healing, not more fear." Stonewolf was silent for several heartbeats. Then, unexpectedly, he extended his hand in the white man's gesture of greeting. "The people remember those who show kindness to our children. Martha, Caldwell has made allies this day." Martha accepted his hand, feeling calluses that spoke of a life as demanding as her own. "I did only what any decent person would do." "Many white settlers would not," Stonewolf stated bluntly. "Many would see only enemy, not child." Deputy Lewis chose this moment to step forward. "As representative of the law in Limestone County, I should inform you that your people are expected to remain west of—" "Deputy," Martha interrupted firmly, "these people have come for their child, not a lecture on boundaries." Stonewolf's expression darkened as he assessed the young lawman. "We know your paper boundaries. We also know when they change without our agreement." The situation threatened to deteriorate, but Tabe suddenly spoke up, addressing his father with animated gestures toward both Martha and the ranch. Stonewolf listened intently before turning back to Martha with renewed interest. "My son says, your land thirsts. No rain for many moons." Martha nodded, surprised by this turn in the conversation. "The drought has been severe. We're struggling to find enough water for the cattle." Stonewolf conferred briefly with an elder warrior before addressing Martha again. "There is water still flowing in hidden places known to the people but not to white settlers." He paused, seeming to make a decision. "I will show you where to find this water, as payment for my son's life." The offer stunned Martha. Access to water during this drought would save her herd, and possibly her ranch. She understood the significance of such knowledge being shared across tribal boundaries. "I would be honored," she replied with genuine gratitude. Over the next hour, an extraordinary council took place on the porch of the Rocking Sea Ranch. Stonewolf, accompanied by two of his senior warriors, sat with Martha and Deputy Lewis, who had wisely holstered his weapon. Using a combination of English, hand gestures, and drawings in the dust, Stonewolf mapped out 3 locations on Martha's property where underground springs remained active despite the drought. "These waters run deep," he explained. "White men dig in the wrong places, too shallow. The people have known these water paths for many generations." Martha offered coffee, which Stonewolf and one warrior accepted while the other declined. The domesticity of the scene, a Comanche chief drinking coffee on her porch while his son played nearby with his brother, struck Martha as surreal yet profoundly significant. As the council concluded, Stonewolf stood and called Tabe to his side. The boy came quickly but paused before Martha, struggling with what he wanted to express. "Thank you," he managed in English, then added something in his own language that made his father's eyebrows rise. "My son says you have the heart of a Comanche mother," Stonewolf translated, a note of respect evident in his voice. "Strong enough to face enemies, gentle enough to heal wounds." Martha knelt to Tabe's level. "You are very brave, Tabe. I won't forget you." The boy impulsively threw his good arm around her neck in a brief hug before returning to his father's side. The gesture brought unexpected tears to Martha's eyes. As the Comanche prepared to depart, Stonewolf approached Martha one final time. 3 days from now, riders will come. They will help find the hidden waters." He paused, studying her face. "The Caldwell Ranch will be known to the people as a place of honor. No harm will come to you or yours from Comanche hands." It was a declaration of protection, rare and valuable beyond measure on the contested frontier. Martha understood the significance and inclined her head in acknowledgement of the gift. "Your son will always be welcome here," she replied. Stone Wolf nodded once, then turned to rejoin his people. Within minutes, the Comanche party had vanished into the western landscape, taking with them the boy, whose chance discovery in a well had created an unlikely bridge between worlds typically divided by fear and bloodshed. Deputy Lewis stood beside Martha, watching their departure with undisguised amazement. "In 15 years on the frontier, I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "Sheriff Hawkins isn't going to believe it." "Then perhaps it's time beliefs changed," Martha suggested quietly. That evening, as the ranch settled into an atmosphere markedly different from the tension of previous days, Martha sat alone on her porch. The drought-stricken land still stretched before her, but now held promise rather than despair. The knowledge of hidden waters, combined with Stone Wolf's pledge of protection, had transformed her circumstances in ways she was still processing. Jackson joined her, offering a cup of coffee as he lowered himself into the adjacent chair. "Quite a day, Mrs. Caldwell." "Indeed," Martha agreed, accepting the steaming cup. "The men are talking," Jackson said after a comfortable silence. "Saying you've done what 3 territorial governors and a dozen military commanders couldn't manage, made real peace with the Comanche." Martha smiled faintly. "I did nothing so grand, Jackson. I simply helped a child who needed it." "Sometimes the simplest actions have the most complex consequences," Jackson observed, with unexpected philosophical depth. "The Ellis brothers won't like it, nor will others who profit from conflict." "They don't have to like it," Martha replied, her tone hardening slightly. "The safety of this ranch and everyone on it has always been my priority. If that safety now includes peaceful relations with the Comanche, all the better." As darkness settled over the land, Martha recalled Taabe's final words to her, translated by his father. "The heart of a Comanche mother." It was perhaps the finest compliment she had ever received, transcending the artificial boundaries that so often separated humanity into opposing camps. 3 days later, as promised, Comanche riders appeared on the horizon. Led by Nashoba, they brought not only the knowledge of hidden waters, but also gifts: expertly tanned hides, a medicine pouch Stone Wolf had personally blessed for protection, and a small carved horse for Martha, a reminder of the boy she had pulled from darkness into light. The drought would eventually break, as all droughts must. But long before the rains returned, the Rocking Sea Ranch flourished, its cattle watered from ancient springs, known only to those who understood that compassion, like water, could flow beneath the most unpromising surfaces, sustaining life where others saw only impossibility. And in years to come, when tensions flared between settlers and native peoples in surrounding territories, the story would be told of Martha Caldwell and Taabe, of a rescue, a healing, and a circle of protection drawn around a modest ranch by a Comanche chief whose son had fallen into the earth and been raised up by unexpected hands. It was a story not of grand treaties or military campaigns, but of the simplest and most revolutionary act possible on the contested frontier, seeing humanity in the other, and responding not with fear, but with the courage to care. The seasons turned with quiet purpose across the West Texas frontier. Summer's brutal drought eventually yielded to autumn's cooler embrace, and then to a winter that brought blessed rain and even occasional snow to the parched landscape. Throughout these changes, Martha Caldwell's Rocking Sea Ranch thrived in ways that confounded neighboring ranches. While other cattle operations struggled with depleted water sources and weakened herds, Martha's cattle remained healthy, watered from the hidden springs Stone Wolf's people had revealed. The mysterious resilience of the Rocking Sea drew speculation and not a small amount of envy from surrounding ranches. "They're saying you've made some kind of devil's bargain," Jackson reported one crisp February morning as he and Martha rode the property's southern boundary. "Ellis claims he saw savages coming and going from our land after dark. Martha merely smiled, adjusting her scarf against the cutting wind. Let them talk, Jackson. Our ledgers speak louder than gossip. Indeed, the financial situation of the ranch had transformed remarkably. With healthy cattle fetching premium prices at market and minimal losses during the harsh seasons, Martha had even managed to set aside funds for property improvements come spring. The rocking sea was not merely surviving, but prospering, a dramatic reversal from the desperate circumstances of 6 months earlier. What Martha didn't share with Jackson was that Ellis wasn't entirely wrong. Comanche riders did occasionally appear at the ranch, though always in daylight and with clear purpose. Sometimes they brought information about weather patterns observed in the distant hills or warnings about cattle rustlers operating in the region. Sometimes they simply passed through, acknowledging Martha with dignified nods before continuing on their way. The promised circle of protection established by Stone Wolf remained intact, manifesting in subtle but significant ways. 3. Times since Tab's rescue, Stone Wolf himself had visited the ranch. Each visit was marked by formal courtesy and growing mutual respect. During his most recent appearance in early winter, he had brought his wife, Sky Flower, a healer whose knowledge of native plants had helped Martha establish a medicinal garden. Behind the main house, these visits were not without complications. Sheriff Hawkins had warned Martha that certain powerful interests in town, particularly those with financial stakes in potential military contracts, viewed her fraternization with hostiles as problematic. Deputy Lewis, however, had become an unexpected ally, having witnessed firsthand the peaceful nature of the Comanche interactions with the ranch. Some folks just prefer their stories simple, he'd told Martha during one of his official visits. Indians bad, settlers good. Makes it easier to justify certain actions. Your friendship with Stone Wolf's band muddies those waters considerably. As winter began its slow retreat before the first tentative advances of spring, Martha found herself reflecting on how profoundly her life had changed since pulling a starving Comanche child from an abandoned well. The act itself had required little deliberation. Any decent person would have done the same, she maintained. Yet its consequences had rippled outward in unexpected directions, transforming not only her circumstances but her understanding of the complex world she inhabited. These reflections occupied Martha as she guided her mare along the eastern property. Line 1, mild March morning. The land was beginning to awaken, patches of green emerging from winter-browned grassland. She had ridden out alone, savoring the quiet companionship of her horse and the promise of renewal evident in the landscape. Her solitude was interrupted by the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Martha reined in her mare, turning toward the sound with curiosity rather than alarm. The Comanche always approached from the west. This rider came from the east, from the direction of town. Within minutes, she recognized Jackson's lean form. Astride his roan gelding, riding hard toward her position. Something in his posture, the forward urgency, the tense set of his shoulders, immediately put Martha on alert. Jackson wasn't one for unnecessary haste. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called as he drew nearer, pulling his horse to a sliding stop beside her. "Trouble coming! Big trouble!" Martha's hand instinctively moved to the rifle in its scabbard. "What kind of trouble, Jackson?" The foreman drew a deep breath, his weather-beaten face gravely. "Senator Preston Williams is in town. Word is he's organizing a militia force to address the Indian problem in the county." Martha felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Senator Williams was a notorious Indian hater whose political career had been built on inflammatory rhetoric against native tribes. His arrival in their small community could only mean escalating tensions. "How large is the force?" she asked, her mind already calculating implications. "Deputy Lewis says maybe 30 men so far, but more are arriving. They're gathering at Ellis Place." Jackson's expression darkened further. And they've got government papers, Mrs. Caldwell. Some kind of official sanction to remove hostile elements from settled territories. Martha absorbed this information with outward calm that belied her inner turmoil. When does Lewis think they'll move out? Tomorrow at dawn. He rode out at first light to warn us. Jackson hesitated. There's more. They've specifically named Stonewolf's band as their primary target, and the Rocking Sea as harboring enemies of American settlement. The accusation was as ludicrous as it was dangerous. Stonewolf's people had maintained peaceful relations with settlers for nearly 2 years, their only crime being their refusal to be forced onto distant reservations where starvation and disease had decimated other tribes. We need to warn Stone. Wolf, Martha decided, turning her horse westward. His people are camped at Crescent Moon Valley. They have women and children with them, Jackson. This won't be a militia action. It'll be a massacre. Jackson nodded grimly. I figured you'd say that. I've already sent Miguel. He knows the back trails better than any of us. Martha gave her foreman a grateful look. Thank you. Organize the men back at the ranch. I want everyone armed but under strict orders. No shooting first, no matter what. We defend our property and our people, nothing more. And if the militia crosses our boundary, then they become trespassers, Martha stated firmly, and we treat them accordingly. With decisive plans made, they rode swiftly back to the ranch, arriving to find the property already buzzing with activity. Deputy Lewis was waiting on the porch, his young face strained with conflicting loyalties. Mrs. Caldwell, I've violated about 6 regulations by coming here, he said as she dismounted. But I couldn't stand by while Williams whips decent men into a killing frenzy with his lies. What exactly is he telling people, Deputy? Martha asked, gesturing for him to follow her inside. Lewis removed his hat as he entered, twisting it nervously in his hands. That the Comanche are planning a massive raid on settlements. That they've been using your ranch as a base to gather intelligence. That you're either a willing collaborator or begging your pardon, enchanted by their heathen ways. Under different circumstances, Martha might have found such accusations laughable. Now they were deadly serious. And Sheriff Hawkins, where does he stand in all this? Opposed but outnumbered politically. Senator Williams brought papers from Austin, executive authorization that technically supersedes local law enforcement. Lewis shook his head in disgust. The sheriff tried arguing that Stonewolf's band has kept every agreement they've made, but Williams isn't interested in facts that contradict his narrative. Martha poured coffee for them both, her movements calm and methodical despite the crisis. Unfolding, I appreciate your warning, Deputy. I assume your presence here isn't officially sanctioned. Lewis acknowledged this with a rueful nod. The sheriff sent me to patrol the eastern county line. What I do during that patrol is my own business. He hesitated. Mrs. Caldwell, I should tell you, some of the militia members were talking about making examples, not just of the Comanche. The implication was clear. Martha herself might be targeted as a sympathizer. I'm not concerned for myself, Deputy, Martha replied, though in truth a cold fear had settled alongside her determination. But I will not stand by while innocent people are slaughtered for political gain. By afternoon, the ranch had transformed into a state of strategic readiness. The women and children of the ranch hands had been gathered in the main house, the most defensible structure on the property. Men were stationed at key positions along the boundaries with strict instructions to observe and report rather than engage, unless absolutely necessary. Miguel returned at sunset, dust-covered and exhausted from his hard ride. Stonewolf had received the warning with grim acknowledgement but no surprise. According to Miguel, the Comanche chief had been anticipating such a move for weeks, having observed increased military scouting in the region. He's moving the women, children and elders to a hidden canyon further west, Miguel reported. But he says some warriors will remain behind to ensure the others' safe passage. He wanted me to tell you. Miguel paused, recalling the exact words. The circle of protection works both ways. Martha Caldwell's courage will not stand alone. Night fell across the ranch, with tense anticipation. Martha found sleep impossible, instead spending hours at her desk writing letters to the territorial governor explaining the true situation with Stonewolf's people, to her banker with instructions for her assets should anything happen to her, and finally a more personal letter to her sister in St. Louis, who had never understood Martha's determination to maintain the ranch after Thomas's death. Dawn approached with deceptive tranquility, painting the eastern sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold that seemed to mock the violence brewing below. Martha, who had finally dozed off in her chair, was awakened by a soft knock at her door. "Riders approaching from the east, Mrs. Caldwell," Jackson reported. "At least 20, moving fast." Martha rose, straightening her clothing and drawing her hair back into a simple knot. There was no time for fear or regret, only for clarity and resolve. "Tell the men to hold positions," she instructed, retrieving her husband's old shotgun from above the fireplace. "No one fires unless fired upon." Outside, the first rays of sunlight illuminated a dust cloud moving steadily toward the ranch. Martha positioned herself on the porch, shotgun held non-threateningly but visibly in the crook of her arm. Deputy Lewis stood slightly behind her, his presence both support and complication. The militia force came into view, a ragged collection of riders led by a distinguished-looking man whose fine clothes and polished saddle marked him as someone unaccustomed to frontier hardship. Senator Preston Williams sat his horse with the stiff posture of a man whose riding experience came late in life, his silver hair and carefully trimmed beard lending him an air of authority belied by the contemptuous curl of his lip. Behind him rode the Ellis brothers, their expressions a combination of anticipation and vindictive satisfaction that sent a chill down Martha's spine. The remainder of the group consisted of various townsmen, a few soldiers in uniform, and several rough-looking characters Martha recognized as drifters who occasionally passed through the county, men without roots or reputations to protect. Procession halted at the edge of the yard, Williams raising a gloved hand to signal the stop. For a moment, only the sound of restless horses and the distant call of a mourning dove disturbed the morning stillness. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Williams called, his voice carrying the practiced projection of a career politician. "I am Senator Preston Williams, authorized by the territorial government to address the Indian menace in this county." Martha took 3 measured steps forward, ensuring her voice would carry equally well. "There is no menace in this county, Senator. Stonewolf's people have maintained peaceful relations with settlers for nearly 2 years. Williams's expression hardened. "Peace bought with concessions and weakness is no peace at all, madam. We have reliable intelligence that the Comanche are planning coordinated attacks on American settlements." "Your intelligence is fabricated," Martha responded evenly, "and you are trespassing on private property." A murmur ran through the militia at her directness. Williams's face flushed with anger. "We have authorization to cross private land in a pursuit of hostile Indians. Step aside, Mrs. Caldwell. Your relationship with these savages is well known, but it will not prevent us from doing what is necessary." Martha's grip tightened on the shotgun. "There are no hostile Indians on my property, Senator, and any man who attempts to cross my boundary line without permission will be treated as a trespasser under territorial law." "You would defend savages against your own kind?" Williams demanded, genuine incredulity in his tone. "I defend justice against prejudice," Martha replied, "and innocent people against those who would harm them for political gain." The standoff might have escalated further had not an unexpected sound drawn everyone's attention, the rhythmic beat of approaching hoofbeats from the west. Martha felt her heart sink, fearing Stonewolf's warriors had decided to make a stand at the ranch despite the overwhelming odds. All eyes turned toward the western ridge, where silhouettes appeared against the brightening sky. But as the figures moved closer, confusion spread through the militia ranks. These were not Comanche warriors, but uniformed cavalry soldiers, riding in disciplined formation behind an officer whose bearing suggested significant rank. The cavalry unit descended the slope with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves between Martha's house and the militia force. Their commander, a handsome man in his 40s, with a precisely trimmed mustache and keen eyes, surveyed the scene with evident disapproval. "Colonel James Thornton, 5th Cavalry," he announced crisply. "Would someone care to explain why armed? Civilians are threatening a private citizen on her own property." Williams attempted to regain control of the situation. "Colonel, I am Senator Preston Williams. We are operating under executive authority to address hostile Indian activity in this region." Colonel Thornton's gaze was coolly assessing. "Are you indeed? How fortunate that I received orders directly from General Sherman regarding this precise situation." He withdrew a document from inside his jacket. "Orders that explicitly countermand any local or territorial authorization for civilian militia. Action against peaceful tribes." Martha could scarcely believe what was unfolding before her. The colonel continued, addressing the militia directly. "Gentlemen, you have been misled. There is no authorized action against Stonewolf's band. In fact, the band in question has been engaged in peace negotiations with the army for months. Negotiations your unauthorized militia action could have irreparably damaged." Williams's face had paled beneath his tan. "This is preposterous. I have documentation that will be reviewed for authenticity." Colonel Thornton cut him off smoothly. "Meanwhile, you and your men will disperse immediately or face charges of insurrection against the United States Army." The transformation was remarkable. Within minutes, the once confident militia began to dissolve. Individual members suddenly remembering pressing business elsewhere. The Ellis brothers lingered longer than most, their expressions promising that the matter was far from settled, but eventually even they departed. Williams alone remained, his earlier bluster replaced by calculating assessment. "You've made a serious mistake, Colonel. I have friends in Washington who will hear about this interference. I look forward to discussing your friends and their authorization of civilian attacks on peaceful Indians when we return to Fort Richardson." Thornton replied evenly. "My men will escort you." Only after Williams had been firmly removed did Colonel Thornton approach Martha, removing his hat with unexpected courtesy. "Mrs. Caldwell, I apologize for this intrusion. General Sherman sends his personal regards." Martha's confusion must have shown on her face, for the colonel smiled slightly. "Perhaps you're unaware that your correspondence with Stonewolf's band has been noted at the highest levels. The peaceful coexistence you've established represents exactly the kind of relationship the more progressive elements in Washington hope to encourage between settlers and native peoples." "My correspondence," Martha echoed, genuinely baffled. A new voice entered the conversation, one Martha recognized immediately. The letters carried between your ranch and my camp, written words exchanged by friends. Stonewolf emerged from behind the cavalry formation, accompanied by 2 warriors, and to Martha's astonishment, Sheriff Hawkins. The Comanche chief approached with dignified steps, his expression betraying nothing to casual observers, though Martha detected a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "The letters," he continued, "that speak of shared water, shared land, shared peace, letters that traveled to Washington with army messengers." Understanding dawned. The army had been monitoring the unprecedented peaceful relations between the Rocking Sea Ranch and Stonewolf's band, recognizing the potential significance of such cooperation in a region traditionally torn by conflict. Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward. When I heard what Williams was planning, I sent word to Fort Richardson. Turns out Colonel Thornton here has been under orders to protect this little experiment in coexistence. They've been watching all along, Martha. Colonel Thornton nodded confirmation. Your demonstration that peaceful cooperation is possible has provided valuable support for those arguing against forced reservation policies, Mrs. Caldwell. Senator Williams represents interests that find such evidence inconvenient. The revelation that their small-scale peace had attracted attention at national levels left Martha momentarily speechless. Stonewolf, however, seemed unsurprised. The path of peace is never simple, he observed, but it is the only path that leads beyond blood and sorrow. As the extraordinary morning transitioned into afternoon, Martha found herself hosting an unprecedented gathering on her ranch. Colonel Thornton and his officers, Sheriff Hawkins, Stonewolf and his companions, and even Deputy Lewis participated in discussions that ranged from practical matters of land use to broader questions of peaceful coexistence between diverse peoples. This isn't the end of such challenges, Colonel Thornton warned as the council concluded. Men like Williams are numerous and politically powerful. They profit from conflict and fear. Then we must make peace more profitable, Martha suggested, an idea that she had been considering for months. Stonewolf's people know this land in ways settlers never will. Their knowledge of water sources saved my ranch. Similar cooperation could benefit others willing to set aside prejudice. Stonewolf considered this thoughtfully, the old ways and the new ways, finding a path together. He met Martha's gaze directly. It begins with one child rescued from a well. It continues with each new hand extended in friendship rather than raised in threat. As her unexpected guests departed, the cavalry east toward the fort, Stonewolf, and his warriors west toward their people, Martha stood on her porch watching them go, aware that she was witnessing not an ending, but a beginning. The fragile peace established between her ranch and Stonewolf's band represented more than just their personal story. It offered a glimpse of a possible future where difference didn't automatically equal enmity. That evening, as lanterns glowed against the gathering darkness, Martha sat at her desk and began to write once more. Not letters this time, but the account of a starving child rescued from a well and the unexpected alliance that had flowered from that simple act of humanity. It was a story worth preserving, worth sharing with those who would come after. Perhaps, Martha thought as her pen moved across the paper, the most revolutionary acts were not the grand gestures recorded in history books, but the quiet moments of compassion that occurred when one human being recognized the humanity in another, even across the boundaries of language, culture, and history that so often divided. The frontier remained a place of challenge and conflict, the future of relations between settlers and native peoples contained no guarantees. But on one Texas ranch, an unlikely fellowship had taken root, proving that another way was possible for those brave enough to imagine it and determined enough to defend it. And it had all begun with a small hand reaching upward from darkness, and another reaching down to help. 5 years passed since the day Martha Caldwell pulled a starving Comanche child from an abandoned well. The Texas frontier had changed dramatically in that time, as had the Rocking Sea Ranch. What had once been a struggling cattle operation fighting to survive drought and isolation had transformed into a prosperous enterprise known throughout the territory for both its fine livestock and its unconventional approach to frontier relations. The drought of 1875 had eventually broken, but the alliance forged between Martha and Stonewolf's band had only strengthened with time. The hidden springs revealed by the Comanche had been developed into a sophisticated irrigation system that allowed the ranch to weather dry seasons that crippled other operations. In return, Martha had provided medical supplies, educational materials, and political advocacy for Stone Wolf's people as encroaching settlement continued to threaten traditional tribal lands. On a pleasant April morning in 1880, Martha stood on a newly constructed viewing platform overlooking the eastern pastures. At 47, her face showed the lines of someone who had faced the frontier's challenges head-on, but her posture remained straight and her eyes clear. Her hair, once chestnut brown, now featured prominent streaks of silver that she made. No attempt to disguise. "Cattle look fine this season," observed Jackson, who had remained her loyal foreman through the years. Now in his 60s, he had begun training younger men to eventually take his place, though he showed no immediate interest in retiring. "Best spring calving we've had since '78. Martha nodded in agreement, shading her eyes against the morning sun. The new Hereford bulls are proving their worth, and the eastern pasture rotation is working exactly as Stone Wolf suggested. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a rider, a tall young man on a magnificent pinto stallion, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had practically been born on horseback. As he drew closer, Martha smiled in recognition. "Speaking of which," she said, "it appears we have a visitor. Taabe, no longer the starving child rescued from a well, but a confident young man of 13 rode into the yard with a wave of greeting. Though he now lived with his people, he visited the rocking sea regularly, serving as both messenger between the ranch and the Comanche band, and as an eager student of the white man's knowledge that Martha had offered to teach him. Martha, he called, dismounting with easy grace. Father sends greetings and news. The transformation in Taabe over 5 years never ceased to amaze Martha. The frightened, injured boy had grown into an intelligent young man who moved confidently between two worlds. His English had progressed from hesitant phrases to fluent conversation, though he retained a musical accent that revealed his native tongue. "Good morning, Taabe," Martha greeted him warmly. "You're earlier than expected. Is everything all right with your family?" Taabe's expression grew serious as he approached. "Mostly good, but Father has heard troubling things from the southwest. Riders came from the Llano Estacado with news that soldiers are forcing all Comanche bands toward the Fort Sill reservation, even peaceful ones who have made agreements with local settlers." Martha frowned at this information. The delicate balance they had maintained locally had always existed under the shadow of larger federal policies that often showed little regard for individual circumstances or successful instances of peaceful coexistence. "Come inside," she invited. "We should discuss this properly." In the main house, now expanded and improved from its humble beginnings, Martha and Taabe sat at a large oak table while Sarah Jenkins, who had stayed on as housekeeper, through the years brought coffee and freshly baked bread. "Tell me everything your father has learned," Martha prompted once they were settled. Taabe related the information with the careful attention to detail he had learned from both cultures, Comanche oral tradition that preserved important stories, with precise accuracy, combined with the analytical approach Martha had taught him through years of informal education. "The soldiers speak with 2 tongues, he explained, using a Comanche expression that had made its way into his English. "They make agreements, then break them when convenient. 3 bands who had peaceful arrangements with Texas settlers were given 1 day's notice to move north or face military action." Martha considered this troubling news. "Has Colonel Thornton been informed? He's been a consistent ally. Father sent messengers to Fort Richardson, but the colonel has been reassigned to Washington." Taab's expression reflected his concern. "The new commander does not know us or our history." This development added another layer of complication. Colonel Thornton had indeed proven a valuable ally, using his influence to protect the unusual. A peace between Stone Wolf's band and local settlers. His replacement by an unknown quantity removed a significant safeguard. "What does your father plan to do?" Martha asked. Taabe hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He has called a council of elders. Some argue we should move north voluntarily ahead of any military effort. Others say we should stand firm on the lands we have occupied for generations." He met Martha's gaze directly. "Father asked me to tell you that whatever decision is made, the circle of protection around the rocking sea will remain unbroken." Martha reached across the table to briefly clasp Taabe's hand. A gesture of appreciation for the loyalty Stone Wolf continued to demonstrate even in the face of new threats. "And I want you to tell your father that my commitment remains equally strong. If there's anything I can do to help, he need only to ask." Their conversation shifted to more immediate concerns: the progress of the spring calving, news from town, Taabe's continuing education. Martha had begun teaching him reading, writing, and mathematics during his first visits after recovering from his injuries. His quick mind and determined application had impressed her, and over the years their lessons had expanded to include history, rudimentary science, and practical business skills. "I've brought something to show you," Taabe said, as their discussion concluded. Reaching into a leather pouch at his belt, he withdrew several folded papers covered in neat handwriting. "I've been practicing writing down our stories, as you suggested. This one tells of how the first horses came to the people." Martha accepted the papers with genuine interest. She had long encouraged Taabe to preserve Comanche oral traditions in written form, believing that such records would become increasingly valuable as the old ways faced mounting pressure from encroaching American society. "This is excellent work, Taabe," she praised after reading several paragraphs. "Your penmanship has improved remarkably, and you've captured the story's essence while making it accessible to outside readers." The young man's face brightened at her approval. "Nashoba laughs at me for spending so much time with paper and ink. He says a true Comanche warrior needs only his memory and his voice." "And what does your father say?" Martha asked, knowing that Stone Wolf's opinion carried particular weight. "He says that a warrior who cannot adapt is already defeated," Taabe replied with evident pride. "That knowledge is a weapon that never dulls, whether carried in the head or on paper." Their conversation might have continued longer had not the sound of approaching riders drawn their attention. Martha moved to the window, immediately recognizing the dust pattern of multiple horses approaching at speed, not the usual gait of casual visitors. "Someone's coming fast," she observed, her frontier instincts automatically shifting toward caution. At least 4 riders. Taabe joined her at the window, his keen eyes narrowing as he assessed the approaching group. "Army uniforms," he identified, before Martha could make out the details. "And," his voice tightened, "Senator Williams." Martha felt a cold sense of foreboding. Preston Williams had never forgiven the humiliation he'd suffered 5 years earlier, when Colonel Thornton had thwarted his militia action. Though he had lost his Senate seat in the subsequent election, due in no small part to the circulating stories of his unauthorized campaign against peaceful Indians, he had maintained his political connections and his vocal advocacy for harsh policies against native tribes. "Taabe, go out the back and stay out of sight," Martha instructed quickly. "If there's trouble, ride to warn your father." For a moment the young man looked ready to object, his expression reflecting the warrior spirit he had developed under his brother Nashoba's tutelage. But years of friendship with Martha had also taught him to trust her judgment. "Be careful, Martha," he said as he slipped toward the rear door. "Williams is a snake who strikes without warning." Martha squared her shoulders and moved to the front porch as the riders entered the yard. Jackson emerged from the barn, positioning himself strategically near the house, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. The 4 men drew their horses to a halt. Besides Williams, now sporting a fuller beard streaked with grey, but maintaining his air of aristocratic authority, there were two uniformed army officers, a captain and a lieutenant, and a thin, severe-looking man in civilian clothes whom Martha didn't recognize. "Mrs. Caldwell," Williams greeted her with cold formality. "It's been some time." "Not long enough," Martha replied evenly. "What brings you to the rocking sea, Mr. Williams? I was under the impression you'd returned to Alabama after losing your seat." A flush of anger colored Williams's face at the direct reference to his political defeat. "I serve the interests of this nation in various capacities, madam. Currently, I'm acting as special advisor to the Bureau of Indian Affairs regarding the completion of tribal relocations in this territory." Martha's concerns deepened at this revelation. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, while ostensibly established to manage relations between the government and native tribes, had become increasingly focused on implementing policies of forced relocation and cultural assimilation. "Allow me to introduce Captain George Reynolds of the 4th Cavalry," Williams continued, gesturing to the senior officer. "And this is Mr. Edwin Pratt, Federal Indian Agent for the Northern Texas Territory." Captain Reynolds offered a stiff nod that suggested he was present in an official capacity rather than by personal choice. Pratt merely examined Martha with the calculating assessment of someone used to cataloguing human beings as problems to be managed. "What exactly is your business here?" Martha asked directly, addressing the captain rather than Williams. It was Pratt who answered, his voice as dry and brittle as autumn leaves. "We are here to inform you that all Comanche bands in this region have been ordered to report to the Fort Sill Reservation within 30 days. Any individuals or bands failing to comply will be considered hostile and subject to military action." Martha maintained her composure despite the chilling finality of the announcement. Stone Wolf's band has maintained peaceful relations with settlers for over 5 years. They've honored every agreement made with both local authorities and military representatives. Williams's smile held no warmth. "The time for individual arrangements has passed, Mrs. Caldwell. The path of progress requires centralized management of the Indian question, not haphazard local accommodations that impede proper development of territories." The clinical coldness with which he dismissed years of successful, peaceful coexistence made Martha's blood boil, but she kept her tone measured. "Captain Reynolds, are you aware that Colonel Thornton of the 5th Cavalry officially recognized and supported the cooperative relationship between the Rocking Sea Ranch and Stone Wolf's band?" The captain shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Colonel Thornton's experimental approaches were tolerated under the previous administration. Current policy favors more standardized solutions." "Standardized solutions," Martha repeated, not bothering to hide her contempt for the euphemism. "You mean forcing people from lands they've occupied for generations onto reservations where they can neither sustain their traditional ways nor properly adapt to new ones." Pratt's thin lips compressed into a bloodless line. "The reservation system is designed to civilize and educate the savage, Mrs. Caldwell. A goal I would expect a woman of your background to support rather than undermine." Martha met his gaze, unflinchingly. "I support justice, Mr. Pratt, and I've seen precious little of it in the government's handling of tribal relations." Williams intervened before the exchange could escalate further. "We didn't ride out here to debate policy, Mrs. Caldwell. We came to deliver official notice and to warn you that your special relationship with Stone Wolf's band must end immediately." "Is that a threat, Mr. Williams?" Martha asked quietly. "It is the law," Pratt interjected. "Any settler found providing material support or harbor to Indians refusing relocation. Orders will face charges of interference with federal agents and potential seizure of property." Jackson moved a step closer to the porch, his protective instincts engaged by the escalating tension. Captain Reynolds noted the movement, his hand shifting subtly toward his sidearm in response. Martha recognized the dangerous direction the confrontation was taking. I understand your position has been stated, gentlemen. Was there anything else? Williams studied her for a long moment, his expression suggesting he had expected either capitulation or more obvious defiance. Not this calm acknowledgement that revealed nothing of her intentions. We'll be establishing a temporary headquarters in town, he finally said. Agent Pratt will be receiving all Comanche reporting for relocation. Those who come voluntarily will be treated fairly. Those who must be persuaded will find the journey considerably more difficult. With these ominous words hanging in the air, Williams signaled to his companions, and the group wheeled their horses around. As they departed, Martha noticed Captain Reynolds glancing back once, an unreadable expression crossing his features before he faced forward again. Once the riders were beyond hearing distance, Jackson approached the porch. "That's trouble riding. Away, Mrs. Caldwell, big trouble." "Indeed it is," Martha agreed grimly. "Find Miguel and send him to the south pasture. I want to know if they're actually returning to town, or if they're planning to track Taabe back to his people." As Jackson hurried to comply, Taabe emerged from his hiding place at the rear of the house. His expression was a complex mixture of anger, concern, and determination. "You heard?" Martha asked, though the answer was obvious. Taabe nodded. "Every word. I must return to warn my father immediately." "Not yet," Martha cautioned. "They may be watching for exactly that. We need to ensure they're truly gone before you leave." She guided him back inside, mind racing with implications and possibilities. "We need to plan carefully, Taabe. Williams isn't just delivering a notification. He's looking for an excuse to provoke a confrontation." Over the next hour, Martha and Taabe discussed options while waiting for Miguel's return. When the ranch hand finally arrived, his report confirmed Martha's suspicions. "They split up at the main road," Miguel informed them. "The captain and the Indian agent headed toward town, but Williams and the lieutenant circled back. They're positioned on the ridge overlooking the western trail, watching." Martha processed this information with the strategic thinking that had kept her ranch thriving against numerous challenges. "They're hoping you'll lead them straight to your people," she told Taabe. "We'll need to outthink them." As the afternoon progressed, Martha formulated a plan that drew on 5 years of collaborative experience with Stone Wolf's band and her intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain. By dusk, preparations were complete. "Are you certain about this?" Jackson asked as they stood in the gathering darkness behind the barn. "Williams isn't just some local troublemaker. He has the government backing this time. I'm certain that I won't stand by while good people are forced from their homes." "Under threat of violence," Martha replied firmly. "Stone Wolf kept his promise to protect this ranch when we needed it most. I intend to honor my commitment to him with equal loyalty." 2 ranch hands had departed earlier, riding conspicuously eastward as if carrying messages to neighboring properties. In reality, they had circled back through a hidden ravine and now waited with spare horses along a concealed trail that would allow Taabe to travel west while avoiding the watchful eyes on the ridge. "Remember," Martha instructed Taabe as he prepared to depart, "tell your father that Williams is looking for any excuse to justify military action. They must avoid confrontation while we explore legal challenges to the relocation order." Taabe clasped her hand firmly. "I will deliver your words exactly." But Martha, his expression grew solemn beyond his years. "My people have heard many promises from white authorities. These promises turn to smoke when they become inconvenient." "I know," Martha acknowledged, "but there are still people of influence who believe in justice. Colonel Thornton is in Washington now. I'll send telegrams tonight explaining the situation, and Judge Harrison in Austin has always supported fair treatment for peaceful tribes." Whether these efforts would prove sufficient remained uncertain, but they represented the best immediate hope for preventing the destruction of all they had built over 5 years of careful collaboration. As Taabe mounted his horse, prepared to slip away under cover of darkness, he turned to Martha one final time. 5 winters ago, you pulled one Comanche child from darkness. Now you seek to do the same for an entire people. Martha smiled, despite the gravity of the situation. One person can't solve everything, Taabe, but they can refuse to be part of the problem. With those words of parting, Taabe disappeared into the night, carrying urgent warnings to his people. Martha returned to the house, where lamplight burned late as she drafted telegrams and letters to every person of influence she could think of who might intervene in the looming crisis. The boundary between legal protest and outright defiance was about to blur, and Martha Caldwell, once simply a widow struggling to maintain her late husband's ranch, found herself at the center of a conflict that would test not only her courage, but her conviction that different peoples could find ways to coexist despite the long shadows of history and the relentless pressure of progress that too often demanded conformity at the expense of compassion. As she sealed the last of her letters, Martha glanced at the carved wooden horse that Taabe had kept during his recovery 5 years earlier and later returned to her as a gift. It sat on her desk now, a simple symbol of the bridge they had built between two worlds, a bridge that powers beyond their control now threatened to burn. The coming days would determine whether that bridge could withstand the flames or would collapse into the ashes of what might have been. Either way, Martha was determined that history would record that some had stood against the tide of injustice, even when victory seemed impossible. Sometimes, she had learned, the act of standing itself mattered more than the outcome. And sometimes, against all odds, such stands changed the course of events in ways no one could predict. Dawn broke hesitantly over the rocking sea ranch, the eastern sky painted in muted strokes of pink and grey that reflected Martha Caldwell's uncertain mood. 3 days had passed since Taabe's departure, 3 days of tense waiting without word from Stonewolf's band. Martha had dispatched her telegrams and letters to potential allies, but responses would take time, a commodity in increasingly short supply. "Riders coming," Jackson announced, entering the kitchen where Martha sat reviewing ledgers in a futile attempt to distract herself. "Army uniforms. Looks like Captain Reynolds and a small detachment." Martha set aside her paperwork and moved to the window. 4 soldiers accompanied the captain, their expressions professionally blank as they approached the house. Unlike William's previous visit, this one carried the formal weight of military authority rather than political maneuvering. "Stay close," Martha instructed Jackson as she stepped onto the porch to meet the visitors. "But let's hear what they have to say before we assume the worst." Captain Reynolds dismounted with crisp efficiency, removing his hat as he approached, a courtesy that suggested this wasn't merely an enforcement action. "Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted her with a respectful nod, "I hope I'm not intruding." "That depends on your purpose, Captain," Martha replied evenly. Reynolds gestured toward the porch. "Might we speak privately? I believe we share certain concerns that would be better discussed away from additional ears." The unexpected request piqued Martha's curiosity. She nodded toward a pair of chairs at the far end of the porch, positioned to capture morning sunlight while offering a measure of privacy. "Jackson, perhaps some coffee for our guests," she suggested, signaling her foreman that the situation didn't appear immediately threatening. Once they were seated, Reynolds glanced back at his men, who remained at a discreet distance with their horses. "Mrs. Caldwell, I want to be clear that what I'm about to say is not official Army position. In fact, if reported, it could potentially end my military career." Martha studied him with renewed interest. "Why take such a risk with someone you hardly know, Captain?" Reynolds's weathered face reflected internal conflict. Because I've served on the frontier for 15 years and seen too many promises broken, too many peaceful situations destroyed by men like Williams who profit from conflict. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. And because Colonel Thornton wrote to me personally before his reassignment, explaining what you and Stone Wolf accomplished here. Hope stirred in Martha's chest, though she maintained her cautious demeanor. And what exactly are you suggesting, Captain? I can't countermand official relocation orders, Reynolds stated plainly, but I can ensure that any enforcement action under my command proceeds with deliberate caution, thoroughness that might create delays, documentation requirements that might temporarily impede implementation. Martha absorbed the meaning behind his careful phrasing. You're offering to stall. Reynolds nodded once. Time is what you need most right now. Time for your telegrams to reach sympathetic ears in positions of authority. Time for legal challenges to be filed. Why? Martha asked directly. Why risk your career for this? The captain's gaze drifted toward the western horizon where Stonewolf's people made their camp. My first posting was at Fort Sill. I've seen what reservation life does to proud people. Starvation, disease, despair. His eyes hardened. And I've seen men like Williams manipulate the system for personal gain while claiming to serve national interests. Martha considered his words carefully. Trust came at a premium on the frontier, especially when livelihoods and lives hung in the balance. Yet something in Reynolds's manner suggested genuine conviction rather than deception. What do you know of Williams's current activities? She asked. He's assembled a group of civilian specialists in town, 20 men, well armed, ostensibly, to assist with the relocation process. Reynolds' expression darkened. But these aren't bureau clerks or interpreters. They're hired guns, including several faces I recognize from wanted circulars. This intelligence confirmed Martha's worst suspicions. Williams wasn't simply implementing government policy. He was orchestrating a confrontation that would justify a military response against Stonewolf's band. And Agent Pratt, Martha inquired, a bureaucrat committed to the reservation system, but not necessarily violence, Reynolds assessed. He believes in the civilizing mission with religious fervor, but lacks Williams' personal vendetta. Martha weighed her options carefully before making a decision. Stonewolf's camp has been relocated to Medicine Bluff Canyon, she revealed, testing Reynolds' reaction. A defensible position with natural springs beyond the normal patrol routes. The captain showed no surprise at this information. A wise precaution. Williams has been pressing me to conduct sweeps along the traditional camping grounds, but I've insisted on proceeding methodically, sector by sector. Their conversation was interrupted by Jackson's return with coffee. Once the foreman had retreated to a respectful distance, Reynolds continued in a lower voice. Mrs. Caldwell, there's something else you should know. A telegram arrived yesterday from Washington. Internal Army communication. He hesitated, glancing around before proceeding. A congressional committee is investigating irregularities in Indian Bureau operations in several territories, including questionable contracts and missing funds. Williams' name appears in the preliminary inquiry. Martha processed this significant revelation. So his sudden zeal for completing tribal relocations might be an attempt to cover his tracks or create a diversion from the investigation. Or to conclude certain arrangements before his authority is questioned, Reynolds agreed. Either way, he's operating with unusual urgency and minimal oversight. Their exchange was cut short by the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats, a single rider approaching at speed from the western trail. Martha recognized Miguel's distinctive riding posture long before his features became visible. One of my hands, she explained to Reynolds, rising from her chair. Excuse me, Captain. Miguel pulled his lathered horse to a stop in the yard, his expression tense as he spotted the military presence. Martha moved quickly to intercept him before he could speak imprudently. "What news?" she asked quietly as he dismounted. Miguel wiped dust from his face, keeping his voice low. "Stone Wolf sends word. William's men have been scouting the western canyons. They found tracks near Deer Creek yesterday and followed them until nightfall." Martha felt a chill despite the warming day. Deer Creek lay less than 5 miles from Medicine Bluff Canyon. Williams was closing in on Stone Wolf's new location. "There's more," Miguel continued grimly. "2 of Stone Wolf's young hunters are missing. They were checking trap lines near the creek and never returned to camp. The implications were ominous. Had the young men been captured? Or worse? Either scenario could escalate tensions beyond peaceful resolution. Martha turned to find Captain Reynolds standing nearby, his expression indicating he had overheard at least portions of Miguel's report. "Missing hunters?" he asked with professional concern. Martha made a swift decision to extend her tentative trust. 2 young men from Stone Wolf's band failed to return from checking trap lines. They were last seen near an area where your civilian specialists were scouting. Reynolds' jaw tightened. William's men were operating outside their authorized parameters. They were explicitly instructed not to engage with any tribal members encountered during reconnaissance. "It seems those instructions were ignored," Martha observed grimly. The captain squared his shoulders, decision crystallizing in his eyes. "I need to return to town immediately. If Williams's men have detained or harmed tribal members without authorization, it falls under military jurisdiction to investigate. And if they resist your authority," Martha pressed, "then their true intentions become clear," Reynolds replied, "and the record will show who instigated any conflict that follows." After the captain's departure with his detachment, Martha assembled her most trusted hands to discuss the deteriorating situation. Jackson, Miguel, and 3 others gathered in the ranch office, their expressions reflecting the gravity of circumstances. "Miguel, ride back to Stone Wolf with a message," Martha instructed. "Tell him about Captain Reynolds's visit and his apparent willingness to create delays, but also warn him that William's men are likely closing in on their location. They should prepare to move again if necessary." As Miguel departed, Martha turned to Jackson. "I need you to go into town. Find Deputy Lewis and discreetly determine what William's men are doing, how many, how armed, and their movements." The aging foreman nodded, though concern etched his features. "And if trouble comes here while I'm gone?" Martha moved to a cabinet against the wall, unlocking it to reveal several rifles and ammunition. "We'll be prepared but not provocative. Self-defense only if absolutely necessary." As her men dispersed to their assignments, Martha returned to the porch, gazing westward toward the invisible boundary that separated 2 worlds. A boundary that had blurred and softened over 5 years of cooperation, only to be redrawn with harsh strokes by distant authorities who valued policy over people. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Martha busied herself with ranch operations, checking on the new calves in the south pasture and inspecting the irrigation system that Stone Wolf had helped design. Practical tasks that couldn't fully distract from the weight of waiting. Late afternoon brought the return of Jackson, his expression grave as he dismounted in the yard. "It's worse than we thought," he reported once they were inside. "Williams has deputized his men under some emergency authority granted by the Indian Bureau. They're calling themselves relocation enforcement officers now." "Deputy Lewis?" Martha asked. "Effectively sidelined. Sheriff's been told the operation falls under federal jurisdiction." Jackson removed his hat, twisting it in weathered hands. "There's talk in town that Williams has offered bounties for bringing in resistant Indians, $5 a head for delivering them to the relocation camp." Martha's disgust must have shown clearly on her face. "He's turned a government policy into a profit opportunity, bounty hunting under color of law. "There's more," Jackson continued reluctantly. "The two missing Comanche hunters were brought in this morning. Williams' men claimed they were caught destroying federal property." "What? Federal property exists in the middle of an open canyon?" Martha demanded. "Survey markers," Jackson explained. Williams apparently had markers placed declaring the area federal reserve land. When the young men removed one, his officers took them into custody. The manufactured pretext was so transparent that Martha might have found it laughable under different circumstances. Now, it represented a dangerous escalation designed to provoke exactly the kind of resistance that would justify harsher measures. "How were they treated?" she asked, dreading the answer. Jackson's expression darkened further. "Badly. Lewis said they were paraded through town in chains before being locked in a storage shed behind the land office. No food or water provided." Martha's hands clenched into fists as she processed this information. Such humiliation and mistreatment would be viewed as a grievous insult by the Comanche, an intentional provocation that Stone Wolf might find difficult to ignore despite his commitment to peaceful coexistence. "We need to get word to Captain Reynolds immediately," she decided. "If he's sincere about preventing unnecessary conflict, this is his opportunity to demonstrate it." Before they could formulate a plan, hoofbeats once again announced an arrival. This time from the east, from the direction of town. Martha moved to the window, surprised to see Deputy Lewis himself riding into the yard, his young face tense with urgency. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called as she emerged onto the porch, "you need to come to town right away. Captain Reynolds has ordered the release of Stone Wolf's men, and Williams is challenging his authority. It's about to turn ugly." Martha didn't hesitate. "Jackson, saddle my horse and bring my husband's shotgun." Within minutes, she was riding toward town alongside Deputy Lewis, who filled in additional details as they traveled. Reynolds returned from patrol and went directly to inspect the prisoners when he heard about their treatment, Lewis explained. He invoked military authority over civilian contractors operating in Indian territories and ordered them released into Army custody. "And Williams objected," Martha surmised. Lewis nodded grimly, claimed the captain was exceeding his authority and interfering with bureau operations. "Last I saw, they were facing off outside the land office with armed men on both sides. I slipped away to find you because—" He hesitated. "Because what?" Martha pressed. "Because Reynolds specifically asked for your presence. Said you were the only person who might prevent bloodshed if Stone Wolf's people learned of the situation." The implication was clear. If word of the young hunter's treatment reached Medicine Bluff Canyon, Comanche warriors might descend on the town seeking justice or vengeance. Martha's established relationship with Stone Wolf represented the best hope for channeling such reactions toward peaceful resolution. They arrived at the outskirts of town to find an atmosphere of simmering tension. Townsfolk had retreated indoors, leaving the main street eerily vacant, except for small groups of armed men positioned at strategic points. Outside the land office, two distinct factions faced each other with barely concealed hostility. Captain Reynolds stood with 6 soldiers in formation, their disciplined posture contrasting sharply with the looser arrangement of Williams's officers. Across from them, Williams himself stood on the porch of the land office, Agent Pratt beside him, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Martha dismounted at the edge of the standoff, Deputy Lewis remaining with the horses as she walked forward alone. Her appearance drew immediate attention from both sides. "Mrs. Caldwell," Reynolds acknowledged with evident relief. "Thank you for coming." William's expression darkened at her arrival. "This is an official federal operation, madam. Your presence is neither required nor welcome." Martha ignored him, addressing Reynolds instead. "I understand you've ordered the release of 2 young men from Stone Wolf's band." "Into military custody, yes," Reynolds confirmed. They were mistreated in violation of Army regulations governing the treatment of non-combatant tribal members. These men destroyed federal property and resisted lawful authority, Williams countered. They fall under bureau jurisdiction, not military. Martha turned her attention to the land office behind Williams. Through a side window, she glimpsed two figures inside the attached storage shed, young men whose proud bearing remained evident despite their obvious mistreatment. "Where is Sheriff Hawkins?" she asked Deputy Lewis, who had moved closer. "County business in Austin," Lewis replied. "Convenient timing." Martha assessed the situation with the practical clarity that had served her through numerous frontier challenges. Armed confrontation between military and civilian authorities would benefit no one, except perhaps Williams, who might welcome chaos that could justify more extreme measures against Stone Wolf's band. "Captain Reynolds," she addressed the officer directly, "I believe I may have a solution that respects both military protocol and bureau authority." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, interested but cautious. "I'm listening, Mrs. Caldwell." "Release the young men into my custody as a neutral third party," Martha proposed. "I will personally guarantee their appearance before any legitimate hearing regarding the alleged property destruction." Williams scoffed audibly. "Preposterous. Your sympathies are well known, Mrs. Caldwell. You would deliver them directly back to their tribe." "Actually," Martha countered smoothly, "I would deliver them to Stone Wolf with explicit instructions regarding the legal process and the importance of addressing these charges properly. Unlike your officers, I have 5 years of demonstrated credibility with both Stone Wolf's band and local authorities." Agent Pratt, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "The suggestion has merit, Senator. It would de-escalate the current situation while maintaining the legal process." Williams turned on Pratt with barely contained fury. "You would trust a frontier widow over federal authority?" "I would trust established diplomatic channels that have maintained peace for 5 years, Pratt replied with unexpected firmness. "If our goal is truly orderly relocation rather than conflict, Mrs. Caldwell's relationship with Stone Wolf represents a valuable resource rather than an impediment." Martha watched the exchange with concealed surprise. Perhaps Agent Pratt's commitment to his civilizing mission included enough genuine concern for native welfare to recognize the destructive potential of Williams's approach. Reynolds seized the opening. "A compromise, then. The young men remain under technical military jurisdiction, but in Mrs. Caldwell's physical custody. She will ensure their proper treatment and their appearance at any legitimate hearing." Williams found himself suddenly isolated, with both military and bureau representatives supporting a solution that would prevent the confrontation he apparently sought. His face flushed with suppressed rage, but political instinct prevailed over emotion. "Very well," he conceded with poor grace. "But Mrs. Caldwell will sign a formal document accepting full responsibility for these prisoners, and if they fail to appear when summoned, she will face charges of interfering with federal operations." Martha nodded her acceptance of these terms, knowing they represented a temporary victory at best. The larger conflict over tribal relocation remained unresolved, but an immediate crisis had been averted. As legal documents were prepared inside the land office, Martha caught Reynolds's eye and nodded slightly in appreciation of his willingness to stand firm. The captain returned the gesture with professional restraint that couldn't quite conceal his satisfaction at outmaneuvering Williams. Within the hour, Martha departed town with 2 silent Comanche riders flanking her horse. Neither young man had spoken during their release, maintaining dignified silence even as their chains were removed. Now they rode straight-backed, despite visible bruises and obvious exhaustion, their expressions unreadable. Only when the town disappeared behind them did the older of the two finally speak, his English halting but intelligible. "Taabe said you would come." Martha glanced at him in surprise. "You've spoken with Taabe." The young warrior nodded once. He told us stories of the woman who pulls people from dark places, who stands between them and harm. A hint of a smile touched his stoic features. Now we have our own story to tell. As they rode westward toward Medicine Bluff Canyon, where Stone Wolf awaited news of his missing hunters, Martha reflected on the unintended legacy that had grown from a single act of compassion years earlier. The rescue of one child from an abandoned well had expanded into something far more significant, a commitment to justice that transcended the artificial boundaries between peoples. The battle with Williams was far from over. His wounded pride and thwarted ambitions would only fuel his determination to destroy what Martha and Stone Wolf had built. But for this moment, riding across the Texas plains with two young lives preserved from injustice, Martha found quiet satisfaction in proving that different choices remained possible even on a frontier where violence too often prevailed over. Understanding, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in amber hues that symbolized both ending and continuation. The complex reality of a story still unfolding between two peoples whose futures had become unexpectedly intertwined. The council fire burned low in Medicine Bluff Canyon, its golden light illuminating the solemn faces of those gathered in its circle. Martha Caldwell sat between Captain Reynolds and Stone Wolf, an unlikely mediator in an unprecedented meeting. 3 days had passed since her intervention in town had secured the release of the young hunters. 3 days of fragile calm, punctuated by increasing tension as Williams continued to consolidate his forces. "The senator has requested reinforcements from Fort Richardson," Reynolds informed the council, his military bearing softened by the informal setting. "Officially, to ensure orderly compliance with relocation directives. Unofficially, to provide the force needed for his true intentions." Stone Wolf's weathered face remained impassive as he absorbed this information. At 53, the Comanche chief carried his years with dignity, the streaks of gray in his hair only enhancing his authoritative presence. "How many soldiers?" he asked directly. "A full company," Reynolds admitted. 40 men plus officers, expected within 5 days. A murmur ran through the assembled tribal elders. Such a force, combined with Williams' hired guns, would make resistance futile. Everyone present understood the implications, though none spoke them aloud. "What of Martha Caldwell's messages to Washington?" Stone Wolf inquired. "Do white chiefs hear her words?" Martha leaned forward, choosing her response carefully. "I've received one reply from Judge Harrison in Austin. He believes the relocation order may be challenged on technical grounds, as your band has maintained peaceful relations under previously recognized agreements." "Technical grounds," repeated Nashoba, Tabe's older brother, with unconcealed bitterness. Now 30, he had grown into a formidable warrior and respected voice within the band. "White man's papers fight, while white man's guns prepare." Martha couldn't dispute the accuracy of his assessment. Legal challenges would take time, weeks or months of careful argumentation in distant courtrooms. Williams' militarized enforcement would unfold in days. "There may be another option," Captain Reynolds suggested, his voice deliberately measured. "One that doesn't require either immediate relocation or direct confrontation." All eyes turned to the army officer, suspicion and hope mingling in equal measure. Reynolds had proven himself distinct from Williams in both character and intention, but he remained a representative of the government that had systematically broken promises to native peoples for generations. The relocation orders specify that all Comanche bands must report to the Fort Sill reservation, Reynolds explained. But there is precedent for establishing temporary supervised encampments during transitional periods, particularly when seasonal conditions might endanger vulnerable members during forced movement. Martha grasped his meaning immediately. You're suggesting a delay under official sanction. Reynolds nodded, continuing his explanation for the tribal leaders. I could authorize a temporary encampment here, designating it as a transitional preparation site. This would satisfy the letter of the relocation order while providing additional months for legal challenges to be heard. Stonewolf considered this carefully. And Williams, he will accept this paper shield? He'll have no choice if it carries proper military authorization, Reynolds replied. At least not without openly defying army authority, which would undermine his carefully constructed legitimacy. And when the autumn comes, when will your transitional period ends? Neshoba pressed, skepticism evident in his tone. Will we simply walk to the reservation then, when legal papers have failed, as they always do? The question hung in the air, addressing the fundamental reality that temporary solutions eventually expired, leaving the same essential problem intact. Taabe, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. Now a young man, straddling two worlds, he had absorbed knowledge from both cultures while maintaining his Comanche identity. His voice carried the thoughtful consideration Martha had encouraged through years of informal education. Perhaps we are thinking too narrowly, he suggested. The white government sees only two paths, the reservation or resistance. But Martha Caldwell and my father created a different path 5 years ago, one of cooperation rather than submission or conflict. Martha turned toward him with interest. What are you proposing, Taabe? A formal agreement, he explained, warming to his concept. Not a temporary delay, but permanent recognition of our band's special status. Land designated for our use, not as a reservation controlled by agents, but as a cooperative territory where we maintain our ways while adapting what serves us from white knowledge. The boldness of the proposal stunned the council into momentary silence. It was unprecedented, a radical reimagining of the relationship between tribal peoples and government authority. Impossible, Reynolds stated, though his tone suggested reluctant dismissal rather than outright rejection. Current policy allows no such exception. Current policy also permitted no exception to drought-stricken cattle dying of thirst, Stonewolf observed with quiet intensity. Yet water was found. When different knowledge was respected, current policy permitted no peaceful coexistence between Comanche and settler, yet 5 years have proven otherwise. Martha's mind raced with possibilities. Judge Harrison mentioned that certain Pueblo communities in New Mexico Territory have maintained limited sovereignty while establishing cooperative relationships with surrounding settlements. It's not exactly the same situation, but it suggests precedent exists for arrangements outside the standard reservation system. Reynolds appeared torn between his practical understanding of bureaucratic realities and the compelling vision being presented. Even if such an arrangement were theoretically possible, Williams would fight it with every resource at his disposal. His influence remained substantial, despite the ongoing investigation. Then perhaps, Martha suggested carefully, the investigation itself provides leverage. All eyes turned to her as she elaborated. You mentioned that Williams' name appears in a congressional inquiry regarding financial irregularities in Indian Bureau operations. What if that information were to become more widely known, specifically to those who might reconsider their support for his current activities? You propose using political weakness against political strength, Stonewolf observed with appreciative understanding. The hunter becoming hunted. Captain Reynolds frowned slightly. The investigation remains confidential, pending formal charges. I shouldn't even know about it, much less share that knowledge. Yet you did share it, Martha pointed out gently, because you recognized that something larger than regulations was at stake. The captain fell silent, internal conflict evident in his expression. His career, his oath of service, and his personal sense of justice pulled him in competing directions. Taabe leaned forward, addressing Reynolds directly. "My father's people have a saying, when the buffalo are gone, even a wolf may need to find new hunting grounds. The old ways of thinking about my people and yours, they are like vanishing buffalo. New paths must be found, even if they've never been walked before." The young man's eloquence, combining Comanche wisdom with the persuasive techniques Martha had taught him from classic rhetoric, made a visible impression on Reynolds. The captain stared into the council fire for several long moments before responding. "I can make no promises," he finally said. "But if you can formulate a specific proposal, something concrete that explains exactly what this cooperative territory would entail, I will ensure it reaches those in Washington who might be receptive, particularly if accompanied by evidence of Williams' more questionable activities in implementing the relocation order." It wasn't a guarantee, but it represented more hope than had existed at the council's beginning. The discussion continued late into the night, with Stone Wolf's wisdom, Martha's practical knowledge of legal frameworks, and Taabe's ability to bridge conceptual divides, combining to outline an unprecedented proposal. By morning, a document had taken shape, not merely a plea for exemption from reservation policy, but a pioneering vision for a new model of coexistence. The proposed Medicine Bluff Cooperative Territory would recognize the Comanche band's right to maintain their traditional lifestyle while establishing formal channels for mutually beneficial exchange with surrounding settlements. As dawn brightened the eastern sky, Reynolds prepared to depart with the document, his expression a mixture of doubt and determination. "I'll do what I can to ensure this reaches sympathetic eyes in Washington. But Williams won't simply wait for bureaucratic processes to unfold. You should prepare for his more immediate actions." "We will be ready," Stone Wolf assured him with dignified resolve. "Not for war, but for standing firm in peace." After Reynolds's departure, Martha remained at the Comanche camp to help refine the proposal and strategize potential responses to Williams's expected escalation. Her extended absence from the ranch would certainly be noted, possibly drawing unwelcome attention. But the critical nature of these negotiations outweighed personal risk. On the morning of the third day, as Martha prepared to return to the rocking sea, a sentry reported riders approaching from the east, a dozen men moving with purpose toward the canyon entrance. "Williams?" Martha asked with alarm as tribal members began securing children and elders deeper within the canyon's protective embrace. The sentry shook his head. "Not military. Ranch horses. Your foreman leads them." Relief flooded Martha as she recognized Jackson at the head of the approaching group, accompanied by Miguel and several other rocking sea hands. Their arrival suggested urgent developments rather than immediate threat. "Mrs. Caldwell," Jackson called as they entered the camp. "Williams is moving ahead of schedule. His men are preparing to sweep the western canyons, starting tomorrow at dawn. They've been distributing handbills in town, offering $10 for each hostile Indian brought in, dead or alive." Martha's blood ran cold at this escalation. The bounty increase and its deadly specification transformed Williams' operation from forced relocation to potential massacre. "How many men?" Stone Wolf asked, having joined them upon hearing the commotion. "At least 30, Jackson reported grimly. "Most newcomers to the territory, hired guns with no connection to local communities who might question their actions." "And Captain Reynolds?" Martha inquired. Miguel stepped forward. "He left for Fort Richardson yesterday to secure official authorization for the temporary encampment." Williams moved the moment he was gone. The strategic timing was no coincidence. Williams had clearly recognized Reynolds as an obstacle and seized the opportunity created by his absence. "We've brought something else," Jackson added, gesturing to a nervous-looking young man in town clothes who had remained half-hidden among the ranch hands. "This is Edward Simmons, clerk at the land office. He has information you should hear." Simmons stepped forward reluctantly, clutching a leather portfolio against his chest. "Mrs. Caldwell, I believe Senator Williams has been engaged in activities that violate federal law." Martha exchanged significant glances with Stonewolf. "What kind of activities, Mr. Simmons?" "Land fraud, primarily," the clerk explained, gaining confidence as he spoke. "The survey markers the Comanche hunters allegedly destroyed, they weren't marking Federal Reserve land at all. They were boundary markers for private land claims being processed under Williams' personal authority, claims that conveniently encompass the most valuable water sources and mineral deposits in the territory." He opened his portfolio, revealing carefully preserved documents. "Williams has been using the relocation directive as cover for a massive land grab. Once the Comanche are removed, these legitimately filed claims will be approved, transferring thousands of acres to corporations in which he holds significant interests." The revelation confirmed Martha's suspicions about Williams' true motivations, while providing crucial evidence of corruption that transcended mere policy disagreements. "Why are you sharing this?" Stonewolf asked the clerk directly, his penetrating gaze causing Simmons to shift uncomfortably. "Because my father was a surveyor who believed in honest work," Simmons replied with unexpected firmness, "and because I saw how those young men were treated when they discovered what was happening. It isn't right, no matter what one thinks about Indian policy." Martha made a swift decision. "Jackson, escort Mr. Simmons to Captain Reynolds at Fort Richardson immediately. These documents could make the difference between our proposal being considered or dismissed." As preparations were made for the clerk's protected journey to the fort, Martha conferred with Stonewolf and the tribal elders regarding the more immediate threat posed by Williams' bounty hunters. "Moving deeper into the canyon system will provide temporary protection," Martha suggested. "There are passages only your people know." Stonewolf nodded in agreement. "The women, children, and elders will go, but some must remain to protect their passage." His eyes moved significantly toward Neshoba and the younger warriors, whose expressions made clear they wouldn't retreat in the face of threat. "Then we need a strategy that doesn't rely on either complete withdrawal or direct confrontation," Martha insisted. "Williams wants a fight, a justification for claiming your people resisted legitimate authority. We can't give him that satisfaction." As key discussions continued into the evening, Taabe approached Martha privately, his expression troubled. "You should return to your ranch," he advised. "Your presence here endangers both you and your people." Martha regarded him with the affection that had grown through years of mentorship. "My place is here, helping to prevent bloodshed." "Your place is where you can be most effective," Taabe countered with gentle insistence. "And that may not be here when Williams's men arrive." His maturity and strategic thinking, qualities she had helped nurture, gave Martha pause. "What are you suggesting?" "That you represent us where your voice carries weight," Taabe explained. "In town, among settlers who might listen to reason, with officials who respect your standing in the community. The battlefield isn't always where weapons are drawn." Martha recognized the wisdom in his perspective. Her presence in the Comanche camp during an enforcement action would likely be used by Williams to paint her as complicit in resistance, potentially undermining her credibility with authorities who might otherwise be persuaded to intervene. By morning, a complex strategy had emerged from the collective thinking of all involved. The Comanche would indeed move deeper into the canyon system, but not in panicked flight. Instead, they would execute a carefully choreographed relocation that left Williams' men chasing shadows while finding themselves observed from hidden positions. Never attacked. but constantly aware they were potentially vulnerable. Meanwhile, Martha would return to town, armed with Simmons' evidence and her own respected position in the community. There she would work to rally support among townspeople whose economic interests might be threatened by William's private land schemes, creating public pressure that could constrain his more extreme actions. As she prepared to depart, Stonewolf approached, carrying a small deerskin pouch. 5 winters ago, you pulled my son from darkness into light, he said, handing her the pouch. Now we face another darkness together. Martha opened the pouch to find a beautifully crafted medallion of polished stone, etched with intertwining symbols. What does it mean? She asked, touched by the unexpected gift. It is the sign of the circle that cannot be broken, Stonewolf explained. Not a circle of protection only, but circle of connection. He gestured toward where Tabe stood conferring with Neshoba. My son walks in 2 worlds because you showed him both worlds hold value. Now many may learn this truth if we succeed. Martha secured the medallion around her neck, its weight a reminder of the responsibility she had assumed through one simple act of compassion years earlier. We will succeed, she assured him with quiet determination, because the alternative costs too much for all of us. Their strategy unfolded over the next 3 days with unexpected effectiveness. William's bounty hunters entered the canyon system with confident aggression, only to find themselves constantly outmaneuvered by Comanche scouts who seemed to anticipate their every move. No shots were fired, no direct confrontations occurred, yet the hunters found themselves exhausted, confused, and increasingly paranoid as their quarry remained perpetually just beyond reach. In town, Martha mobilized a coalition of concerned citizens alarmed by evidence that William's land schemes would monopolize critical water access for surrounding ranches and farms. When the local newspaper editor, initially skeptical, confirmed the authenticity of certain documents, public opinion began shifting decisively against the senator's operations. The pivotal moment came on the 4th day, with the return of Captain Reynolds from Fort Richardson. He arrived not with a small escort, but with a full cavalry troop and official orders that immediately changed the landscape of conflict. Senator Williams, Reynolds announced formally in the crowded town square, you are hereby relieved of all authority regarding Indian relocation operations in this territory, pending investigation of serious allegations concerning abuse of office and misappropriation of federal resources. William's face contorted with rage and disbelief. This is preposterous. By whose authority? By direct order of the Secretary of War, Reynolds interrupted, producing a document bearing an unmistakable official seal. Furthermore, all enforcement officers commissioned under your authority are immediately disbanded. Any individual continuing to act in such capacity will face military arrest. The transformation was remarkable to witness. William's carefully constructed power structure crumbled virtually overnight, his hired guns quietly disappearing rather than risking confrontation with federal troops. The senator himself departed for Washington 2 days later, ostensibly to address these slanderous fabrications personally, but more likely to attempt damage control as the investigation gained momentum. In the aftermath, Martha found herself once again at a council fire in Medicine Bluff Canyon, this time joined not only by Captain Reynolds, but by territorial officials, including Judge Harrison, who had traveled from Austin to witness the unprecedented proceedings firsthand. I make no guarantees, the judge cautioned as he reviewed the proposal for the cooperative territory. This represents a significant departure from established policy. There will be resistance from multiple quarters. Yet you are here, Stone, Wolf observed with quiet certainty, which suggests possibility where others see only barriers. Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. I've reviewed the evidence of your band's peaceful coexistence with surrounding settlements over the past 5 years. It presents a compelling case for exploring alternatives to the reservation system, at least in limited, carefully monitored circumstances. The ensuing discussion stretched late into the night, filled with detailed negotiations, compromises, and occasional breakthroughs. By dawn, a framework had emerged, not the full recognition Stone Wolf's people had hoped for, but far more than the forced relocation Williams had intended. The Medicine Bluff Cooperative Territory would be established as a 5-year pilot program, allowing Stone Wolf's band to remain on their traditional lands while establishing formal relationships with surrounding communities. They would maintain significant autonomy in internal governance, while accepting certain federal oversight regarding external relations. Most importantly, the agreement explicitly recognized the successful peaceful coexistence that Martha and Stone Wolf had fostered as a model worth exploring rather than an anomaly to be eliminated. If successful, the approach might be expanded to other bands and tribes willing to participate in similar arrangements. 1 month later, as summer heat shimmered across the Texas landscape, Martha stood on her porch, watching a most unusual procession approach the rocking sea ranch. Stone Wolf led a group of tribal members toward the main house, where territorial officials waited to witness the formal signing of the final cooperative territory agreement. Tabe rode at his father's side, the young man's bearing reflecting both Comanche dignity and the education Martha had helped provide. He had been instrumental in drafting key portions of the agreement, his unique perspective bridging cultural divides that had previously seemed insurmountable. "It began with water from hidden springs," Jackson observed, standing beside Martha, as they watched the approaching riders. "Now it's about sharing something even more valuable." "Understanding," Martha agreed softly, "and the recognition that different doesn't automatically mean opposed." As the two groups came together, officials in formal attire, tribal members in traditional dress, Martha remained slightly apart, content to witness the culmination of a journey that had begun with one simple choice 5 years earlier. The rescued child had grown into a young man who helped rescue an entire people. The widow, struggling to maintain her ranch, had found purpose beyond mere survival. Stone Wolf approached her before the ceremony began, his typically stoic expression softened by rare emotion. "The people will tell this story for many generations," he said. "How a woman pulled a child from darkness, and in doing so created light that others could follow." Martha touched the stone medallion that hadn't left her neck since he had given it to her. "I only did what seemed right in the moment," she replied honestly. "I couldn't have imagined where it would lead. The greatest journeys often begin with the smallest steps," Stone Wolf observed with quiet wisdom, "just as the strongest trees grow from seeds no larger than a fingernail." As the formal signing proceeded, Martha found herself standing beside Tabe, who watched the proceedings with thoughtful intensity. "Is it everything you hoped for?" she asked him quietly. Tabe considered the question carefully before responding. "It is a beginning, not an ending. The path ahead remains difficult." He turned to her with a smile that bridged the years between the frightened child in the well and the confident young man who had helped shape his people's future. "But difficult paths are still worth walking when they lead toward justice." Martha nodded in agreement, her gaze moving across the gathered witnesses to this unprecedented occasion. Comanche elders whose initial skepticism had given way to cautious hope. Territorial officials whose rigid thinking had been challenged by demonstrable results. Ranch hands and tribal members who had moved from mutual suspicion to respectful cooperation. The world remained far from perfect. The agreement represented one small exception to policies that continued to devastate native peoples across the American frontier. William's defeat was personal rather than systemic, and similar forces continued to advance the relentless machinery. of progress at the expense of indigenous cultures. Yet in this moment, on this patch of Texas soil, something remarkable had flowered from the simple act of recognizing humanity across the artificial boundaries of race and culture. One child, rescued from a well, had led to a community rescued from destruction. One woman's compassion had expanded into a network of relationships that transformed an entire region. As sunset painted the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold, Martha thought of Thomas and the dream they had shared of building something meaningful on this frontier land. The rocking sea ranch had indeed become something significant, not merely a successful cattle operation, but a proving ground for the radical notion that different peoples could find ways to coexist through mutual respect rather than domination or submission. It had all begun with a starving Comanche child in an abandoned well and a woman who chose to see not an enemy, but a fellow human being in need. From that single moment of connection, something profound had grown, a reminder that even in the most divided times, individual choices could create ripples that eventually transformed the landscape itself. As the formal ceremony concluded, and celebratory fires were lit against the gathering dusk, Martha stood at the periphery, content to witness the continuation of a story that would outlive her. A legacy not of conquest or surrender, but of the more challenging, more enduring path of understanding across the boundaries that so often divided humanity against itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.